Deconstruction, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Although deconstruction has roots in Martin Heidegger's concept of destruction, to deconstruct is not to destroy. Deconstruction is always a double movement of simultaneous affirmation and undoing. It started out as a way of reading the history of metaphysics in Heidegger and Jacques Derrida, but was soon applied to the interpretation of literary, religious, and legal texts as well as philosophical ones, and was adopted by several French feminist theorists as a way of making clearer the deep male bias embedded in the European intellectual tradition. To deconstruct is to take a text apart along the structural fault lines created by the ambiguities inherent in one or more of its key concepts or themes in order to reveal the equivocations or contradictions that make the text possible. For example, in Plato's Pharmacy, Derrida deconstructs Socrates' criticism of the written word, arguing that it not only suffers from internal inconsistencies because of the analogy Socrates himself makes between memory and writing, but also stands in stark contrast to the fact that his ideas come to us only through the written word he disparaged, d. 61-171. The double movement here is one of tracing this tension in Plato's text, and in the traditional reading of that text, while at the same time acknowledging the fundamental ways in which our understanding of the world is dependent on Socrates' attitude toward the written word. Derrida points out similar contradictions in Philosophical Discussions of a Preface, by G. W. F. Hegel, d. 1-69, and A Picture Frame, by Immanuel Kant, tp 17-147, which are simultaneously inside and outside the respective works under consideration. Since the distinction between what is inside the text, or painting, and what is outside can itself be deconstructed according to the same principles, deconstruction is, like destruction, an historicizing movement that opens texts to the conditions of their production, their context in a very broad sense, including not only the historical circumstances and tradition from which they arose, but also the conventions and nuances of the language in which they were written and the details of their authors' lives. This generates an effectively infinite complexity in texts that makes any deconstructive reading necessarily partial and preliminary. Table of Contents: Destruction, Deconstruction, Early Formulations, Literary Deconstruction, Contentions and Confrontations, Later Versions, Feminist Deconstruction, References and Further Readings, References, Additional Readings. 1. Destruction. Heidegger's use of the word destruction suffers from the same problem as Edmund Husserl's use of Intentionalität. Neither is an ordinary German word. Both were borrowed from Latin almost as neologisms to express a concept their creators perceived as relatively new to the philosophical domain, only to have the words become confused with their more common cognates when translated into French or English. The usual German word for destruction is Zerstörung, but Heidegger's concept of destruction is also closely related to Abbau or dismantling. Derrida uses the word deconstruction to capture both German terms. EO 86-6. In Being and Time, Heidegger says that the purpose of destruction is to arrive at those primordial experiences in which we achieved our first ways of determining the nature of being, the ways which have guided us ever since BT 44. This is the double gesture referred to above, one that takes apart the European traditions and in so doing finds the basic understanding of being beneath its surface. This goal separates destruction from deconstruction, not because deconstruction is purely negative, but because it has no fixed endpoint or goal. Deconstruction is always an ongoing process because the constantly shifting nature of language means that no final meaning or interpretation of a text is possible. Subsequent ages, grounded in a different language and different ways of life, will always see something different in a text as they deconstruct it in the context of the realities with which they live. What is meant by the written word, for example, has already evolved substantially since Derrida wrote Plato's Pharmacy, due to the explosion in electronic media. All deconstruction can reveal or temporary and more or less adequate truths, not more primordial or deeper ones. For Heidegger, on the other hand, the primordial experiences of being revealed through destruction result in a single interpretation that offers a more authentic alternative to philosophy's misunderstanding of the temporality and historicality of human existence. Temporality and historicality are essential components of Dasein, Heidegger's term for human existence, because it is thrown projection, that is, an entity necessarily oriented toward an unknown future, but always based on a past for which it is not itself fully responsible and which it can never fully know. Time, then, is not only a category of experience, as in Kant, but the very core of our existence. as beings in a present moment are defined in terms of a past that creates our possibilities and a future into which we project them. On a larger scale, this temporality of Dasein, as opposed to Hegelian spirit, is what creates history. Our ability to project forward and interpret backwards not only the circumstances of our lives, but also those of the entire social world to which we belong. For Heidegger, destruction of the traditions in that social world can lead us back to a past that can be reinterpreted in ways that reveal the deeper understanding of being hidden in the earliest texts of the European tradition. It can offer ways to project a different, more authentic future for Dasein based on the new way of seeing the past. 2. Deconstruction. A. Early formulations. As already noted, deconstruction differs from destruction in that it has no fixed or expected endpoint or map, but is rather a potentially infinite process. Although obviously a critical tool, it also lacks the sense, evident in Heidegger, that the text to be deconstructed as part of how European thought has somehow gone wrong and needs correction. This is because deconstruction rejects both the idea that there is a fixed series of eras, ancient, medieval, modern, in European history that mark a downward path, and the idea that there is some determinate way in which that path might be reversed, by a reinterpretation of early Greek philosophy. Rather, Derrida insists that what he deconstructs are texts that he loves, EO 87, and they are vital parts of our intellectual world, with a view to revealing their underlying complexities and hidden contradictions. He does not seek to undo Kant, for example, or interpret his writings in ways closer to Derrida's own vision of what philosophy should be, but rather shows us the ways in which Kant both changes and continues the metaphysical tradition, as well as the ways in which Kant's texts undo themselves along the same fault lines that have undermined that tradition throughout its history. In 1967, Derrida offered this definition: to deconstruct philosophy, thus, would be to think, in the most faithful, interior way, the structured genealogy of philosophy's concepts, but at the same time to determine, from a certain exterior that is unqualifiable or unnameable by philosophy, what this history has been able to dissimulate or forbid, making itself into a history by means of this motivated repression, page 6. What is outside of, or excluded from the realm dominated by the philosophical tradition, although unnamed in it, provides a vantage point and a key with which to find the flaws and lacunae that domination seeks to hide. The opposition between the spoken and written word in Plato, the text in its introduction in Hegel, the painting in its frame in Kant belong to a series of oppositions: good, evil, mind, body, male, female, center, margin, necessary, contingent, and so forth. That run though and in many ways structure the European philosophical tradition. Each of these pairs is also a hierarchy meant to exclude both the non-dominant member of the pair, the body, the female, the margin, the contingent, and anything outside the opposition, the ambiguous, the borderline, the hybrid, from the philosophical realm. These hierarchical oppositions, in turn, create the basis for political hierarchy and social domination: male, female, freeman, slave, propertied, landless, Christian, other, citizen, immigrant, power differentials that motivate the repression to which Derrida refers. This is why deconstruction denies the possibility of some pre-Socratic, primordial experience of being to be found through dismantling the metaphysical tradition, which could then solve the problems that tradition has created, because that experience, too, would be subject to deconstruction along these same lines. What deconstruction reveals, among other things, is that the repression that is necessary for creating a history of philosophy is in large part a repression of what philosophy itself cannot control, of what escapes the grasp of philosophy while being part of it. The fault lines that deconstruction follows are the traces left inside philosophy by what it must define as exterior to it in order to be philosophy. Derrida's early work connects these fault lines to what is represented by the written word, our inability to control or limit the meaning that might be given to our words because of the historical development of language. The ambiguity of linguistic meaning, and the ability of written text to be excerpted, reproduced and read in contexts we can neither imagine nor control, as opposed, supposedly, to the immediate and limited context of the spoken word. This is why any text can be deconstructed, even Friedrich Nietzsche's fragmentary message, "I have forgotten my umbrella," in Spurs, but canonical texts, Plato, Kant, Hegel, later Heidegger himself, offer the richest and most productive grounds for deconstruction. We learn more about ourselves by seeing the traces of a fear of absolute loss that motivate the Aufhebung in Hegel's texts, than we might from finding the same anxiety in the writing of someone whose influence on European philosophy and politics has been less profound. As an example of deconstruction here, however, it seems advisable to choose a text closer to Nietzsche's umbrella than Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. The Truth in Painting takes its title from a letter in which Paul Cézanne tells Émile Bernard, "I owe you the truth in painting, la vérité en peinture, and I will tell it to you." Derrida points out that the philosophy of language would assert that in writing this, Cézanne must have known what he meant, but in fact the sentence itself has no determinate meaning. The truth in painting escapes and exceeds the boundaries philosophy wants to draw with regard to language because it has at least 4 meanings, none of which is reducible to any of the others. 1. The truth about truth itself to be found in or through a painting or other work of art, such as the truth Heidegger finds in Van Gogh's painting of the shoes in Origin of the Work of Art. 2. The truth of the painting is painting, that is, how true to life it is, how well it succeeds in representing what it is meant to represent. 3. The truth about its object that can be found through the painting, such as when a portrait lays bare the character of its subject. And 4. The truth about painting in the sense of what is true in painting as a human enterprise or art form. This ambiguity of the French sentence is compounded by the fact that Cézanne promises not to paint the truth, but to tell or say it in language, thus linking text and painting in a complex nexus of possible meanings and realizations. There is, and can be, no single meaning of this sentence simply because of the rather ordinary, but untranslatable, French phrase, en peinture, as is sometimes the case with the deconstruction of such partial and cryptic texts. Derrida's target here is not Cézanne's words themselves, but rather the account of truth and promises, the implicit debt in Cézanne's "I owe you" found in contemporary philosophy of language. Not only does this sentence fail traditional philosophical tests for having a truth value, due to its ambiguity, it also fails to have the conditions of satisfaction, with which more recent philosophy of language hoped to replace those tests and determine whether Cézanne paid his debt, by deconstructing the phrase, the truth in painting. Derrida hopes to underscore the pragmatic reality that how language functions as a living phenomenon makes it impossible to develop purely formal criteria for identifying or cataloging true statements. B. Literary deconstruction. One notable fact about the reception of deconstruction in the United States was its relatively early acceptance by departments of literature compared to departments of philosophy. Undoubtedly, there are several reasons for this, but one may be that, as Jeffrey Hartman notes, deconstructive criticism does not present itself as a novel enterprise, because the ambiguity and contextuality, the interplay of the spoken and written word, that deconstruction emphasizes in philosophical texts are both more obvious and more acknowledged in literary ones. At the same time, deconstruction, by foregrounding the fact that everything we thought of as spirit, or meaning separable from the letter of the text, remains within an intertextual sphere, DCV, opened important channels of communication between philosophy and literary studies. The tools of deconstruction and the sorts of truths they reveal are similar in both spheres. The basic strategy is still to follow the trace of a key ambiguity or blind spot through the text to illuminate hierarchical oppositions it relies on and the fault lines along which it can be undone, while still acknowledging its power and importance in European thought. Ernest Jones' classic psychoanalytic reading of Hamlet, for instance, is deconstructive in that it foregrounds the suppressed patricide in Julius Caesar. Shakespeare ignores the fact that Brutus was Caesar's illegitimate son, thus implying an invariant, beloved, father, legitimate, son pair, and then uses this omission as one key in tracing the Oedipal fault line in the later play. Here deconstruction yields, not a new meaning to Hamlet, as one could say Derrida does in his discussion of prefaces in Hegel, but a new richness to our understanding of Shakespeare's work. This highlights the fact that deconstruction plays a different role in literature than in philosophy. Deconstruction tends to be used in literary theory in arguments between and among theorists about the value of their theories, rather than about the value of the texts under discussion. One deconstructs Kant to argue with Kant, and perhaps others, but one doesn't deconstruct Shakespeare to argue with Shakespeare, or, as we saw above, Cézanne to argue with Cézanne. In addition, literary deconstruction is about texts that are of a different nature than the deconstruction itself, while the deconstruction of one philosophical text results in another philosophical text. This makes it much clearer in philosophy that deconstructive texts can themselves be, in fact must be, deconstructed. What literary deconstruction produces, on the other hand, is not itself literature. This doesn't mean that literary deconstructions cannot be deconstructed, but that they are not deconstructed in the same way that they are constructed. The context in which such a deconstruction might be carried out is quite different from the context in which the original deconstructive text was created. Put another way, literary deconstruction assumes the possibility and reality of literature in at least some sense of the term, whereas deconstruction as a philosophical enterprise questions, at its most basic level, the possibility of philosophy itself. C. Contentions and confrontations. Deconstruction has always been engaged in active dialogue with other contemporary approaches to philosophical and literary texts. The most productive of these conversations have been with those schools of thought that are closest in history and orientation to deconstruction, often sharing its roots in Heidegger's work. At the same time, the issues raised in those debates are often similar to those raised by more strident critics completely opposed to the deconstructive enterprise. A brief summary of some of the most notable confrontations, across more than 20 years, offers an opportunity to consider the most powerful objections to deconstruction, from the end of the 20th century onwards. The 1981 conversation between deconstruction, in the person of Derrida, and hermeneutics, in the person of Hans-Georg Gadamer, raises at least two recurrent themes. The first has already been indirectly discussed: the charge that deconstruction is a negative enterprise. Gadamer, who speaks of the debate as one between Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche and Derrida's, calls deconstruction a repudiation of the language of concepts, that is the legacy of European philosophy, DD 101.